Hey everybody, what's going on? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Got a friend from the CBS family here, Rocca. How are you, man?
Hey DJ, good to see you. Thanks.
Good to meet you. Congrats on the book.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It's like I imagine it's like what giving birth to octuplets feels like.
How long did this thing take?
About 2 years, because it started as a podcast called Mobituaries, and then became a book with a whole lot of stories not in the podcast. But it's fun. There are a lot of people and things that have died that are in the past to choose from. So, and the list is growing all the time.
You kind of strike me as somebody that thinks about the world a little bit differently than others, meaning like, you know, some people haven't gotten their shine in the same way that you thought they would. So when you kind of think about things, how do you focus on what interests you?
Well, I first focus on what actually is kind of hitting me in the gut, what's interesting to me, and I think it's funny. It's important to sort of pursue what you're interested in, like what you like, and go with it. I've tried to do that all of my career, so I'm a big American history buff. I was interested in my early 20s in obscure presidential sites. I just was interested in
like, give me an example of one.
Like Rutherford B. Hayes, his house in Fremont, Ohio, or Chester Alan Arthur, who was from northern Vermont. And I thought, who would go and work at that house? Who would volunteer to give tours there? Because you know, I grew up in the D.C. area, and I went to Monticello, to Jefferson's house, and that you get, like that's Thomas Jefferson.
Absolutely. Or you go to Lincoln's place, you're like, all right, we get it, right?
It's Lincoln. It's the log cabin. It's the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the Civil War. We get it. But like, why would you go to the Benjamin Harrison house on Delaware Avenue in Indianapolis?
I
mean,
what prompts you to do that? Exactly.
And I met a woman who was working there, volunteering for 22 years, and she gave such a tour that by the end I wanted to sandblast Mount Rushmore and replace it with Benjamin Harrison because she was that. So that's always drawn me, people who are committed in that way. And there are people. Everyone's going to be forgotten. Sorry, not to bring everyone down.
Nope, it's going to happen no matter who you are.
Yeah, everyone will be forgotten. So there are people that are still famous now, people that were never famous that are interesting to me, and both stories are worth telling, as long as I think I have something to add.
Totally. So as a history buff, you can certainly think about this idea of narratives being formed, like in terms of like the greatest moments in history, like they're through a certain lens with a certain group of people telling that story. So when you thought about these people that have passed away, how do you think about the way that we shape narratives in our culture?
Well, I think a good example of that is somebody like Billy Carter, and it felt like a very personal story. So President Jimmy Carter had a younger brother, 13 years younger, named Billy Carter. Billy Carter became kind of like, I want to be diplomatic about it, but he was a kind of an outrageous figure. He was kind of a goofball.
A little bit out there.
Yeah, and he had these big blocky glasses and sort of played the redneck role. You could tell even then he was sort of exaggerating it. He had a beer called Billy Beer. This is while his brother, who didn't drink, who was a teetotaler, was in the White House. His 13 years younger little brother is on TV hawking beer, doing belly flop contests. And he died in 1988 at the age of 51 of pancreatic cancer. He was a complicated, interesting guy, and I wanted to tell his story because he'd been shoehorned into wacky, goofball younger brother. And to me, it felt like a story both about presidential history, because there's a long tradition of troublemaking siblings who must give their brothers and eventually their sister like a headache, the occupant of the White House. But it was also a story about siblings, and so it's understandable that his story has been shaped in a very rigid, kind of bite-sized way, like, oh, the joke of the younger brother, but there's another way of telling the story.
We like to put people in boxes, you know, it's just really easy to comprehend that way. Like, that's a perfect example. It's like there's much more than meets the eye. Yeah,
I mean, think about it. Here is somebody, you're living your life, and suddenly in a very small town in southwest Georgia, and then your brother decides to run for president. You can't stop him, and you want to support him. So the international media descends on your small town and starts picking apart your family. I know if I were in my late 30s like he was then, with 6 kids, I couldn't have handled that pressure.
Can't even imagine.
And so I would have gone on Merv Griffin on the big talk shows of the day, and instead of drinking out of what should be water, drinking liquor to get through it. And, you know, I mean, it was a crazy time for the guy.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that comes with stuff like that.
Yeah.
So in your book here, you have a ton of different people. I mean, we go Thomas Paine versus T-Pain. We got all the different options here, which, by the way, that one is great because, like, I'm reading those quotes and I'm like, honestly, like, it's a toss-up, you know? You really have to think there. Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. There's Thomas Paine, the undersung founding father, the man who wrote Common Sense, which galvanized the American people. They weren't even known as Americans then, to different colonies, to rebel against the British, to break. And then T-Pain, who is pretty great and wrote I'm in Love with a Stripper. I think that's one of his.
That's one of his jams.
You know, that and Common Sense, but they both have merits. And T-Pain, by the way, and it stands for Tallahassee Pain. Yeah. He does actually have a great voice.
He does.
He's more than the auto-tune guy.
But he's auto-tuned that, and that's a big part of how we look at certain things in the music industry.
Right, isn't it? No, but with Thomas Paine, I thought I actually put the CBS News polling unit on it to find out if Americans today recognize him as a founding father, and they don't. And this guy wrote this pamphlet, Common Sense, which articulated why the colonists should rebel against the crown. And until that point, Virginians and Marylanders and New Yorkers saw each other as sort of separate peoples. He took the word American, and by the way, he's the reason it's called the United States of America, and he, through this pamphlet, convinced people that we all had common cause and should rebel. And so it turns out he had a pretty terrible personality. And also, he was that guy that, you know, when you have dinner and you're like, I don't want to talk about the issues right now.
That's him?
Yeah, he wasn't that guy. He
wanted to talk about everything.
The issues. He only wanted to talk about the issues. Like, we're only talking about the issues. And you're like, let's just talk about a stupid TV show.
Just anything else, Thomas. Come on, man.
I mean,
like, your work's great, Common Sense, amazing pamphlet, but like, how's your life going? You know?
Yeah, like, what's up? Like, let's hang. Like, let's. I mean, he was incapable of that. And he drove the other founding fathers nuts.
And hence, his story was formed. And he was out and forgotten.
6 people showed up at his funeral. That's pretty rough.
That's insane.
That's rough. That's terrible.
It is really rough.
Yeah.
And we read Common Sense when we're growing up in school. It's a part of our history, but he's not in that pantheon.
No, in his obituary at the time, written in a paper called The American Citizen, the quote was, "He had lived long, done some good, and much harm. The end." I mean, that was rough. So I wanted to not only reflect on him, but also to kind of give him advice from the future on what he might have done differently. He had a bad temper. He wrote a letter trashing George Washington. You just don't do that. You just don't trash the father of your country. And then he followed it up by trashing Jesus. So, like, from the father of his country to the Son of God. I mean, you just
it's not going to sit well with a lot of people. Let's put it that way.
It's going to turn a lot of people off. Know your audience is the lesson.
He definitely didn't with that stuff. That's for sure. Right. So, thinking about the book here, you mentioned a ton of people, but like, who are a couple people under the radar that we'll find out about here that are like, oh, this person's really interesting and hasn't been talked about enough?
Well, there's this woman, Elizabeth Jennings, and she is an African-American woman who, almost exactly 100 years before Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, Elizabeth Jennings is trying to go to church in Lower Manhattan here in New York. She gets kicked off of a horse-drawn streetcar, which is basically the public transportation of its day. She ends up suing. And this is a black woman in the 1850s, and she ends up suing in civil court, and a jury of all white men rules on her side, and she wins. And it's called a railroad company. It was a horse-drawn streetcar. The railroad company immediately changes their policies, and the other transportation companies in New York follow suit. It spreads to other cities. In Philadelphia, a guy named Robert Smalls, a former slave who then became a congressman, he leads the movement there to integrate their public transportation system. So she's kind of the Rosa Parks of New York a century before, and people don't remember her. And she was known at the time. So, and the date of her court victory, which was actually celebrated annually for a while. One theory, one professor I talked to, and I buy this, says the reason people don't really know her story is people in the North don't like to acknowledge a segregationist past. They like to say, that was all the South.
Right, it was all the South.
I mean, New York had slavery until 1827, so not that long before the Civil War.
It's funny how people like to avoid certain topics like that. It's like, this is a part of the story. We have to consider everything.
Yeah,
you know?
I think so. I think that's right. I also try to be kind to the past, to like, you know, people are messy and the past is messy, and I think I worry about sort of saying, you know, the past was bad and backward. It's past. It's not by definition backward. There's a lot of wisdom to be gained.
And there's certain things where you look at and you're like, all right, this probably should not have been happening, but let's consider the context of the situation, you know?
Completely. I talked to the Pulitzer Prize winner, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she said, I said, do we need to cut the past some slack? And she sort of seized on that and said, yes. And she said, listen, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, should have let more Jewish refugees into the country before World War II and during World War II. The internment of Japanese Americans was really bad, but he brought us through World War II and the Great Depression. Abraham Lincoln did not think that African Americans should have the right to vote. Had he not been murdered in 1865, who knows what he would have ended up thinking. He did not believe in interracial marriage. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So these are things we wish weren't the case, the bad parts, but they don't disqualify the person from history. I mean, we had to
keep it all in context.
In context.
Yeah. Well, speaking of presidents, you have John Quincy Adams in there, his life after being the president.
Well, right, and that's something, you know, a lot of the time people will say about Jimmy Carter. They'll say he's an amazing post-president.
Right.
And he is. I mean, he keeps, like, he's unstoppable.
You can't kill him, right? He's still going.
He's like one of those movies.
He's got like 9 lives, you know, it's crazy.
Completely. I mean, like, he's breaking everything, and then he's, like, teaching Sunday school.
Right.
Like, it's amazing.
And you're like, how old are you? You're almost 100 years old.
Right,
You know?
he's really
it's
old.
insane.
And so, but I wanted to create sort of a Mount Rushmore of post-presidents, and one who, like Jimmy Carter, had a lackluster single term in office was John Quincy Adams. His father had been president. He wanted to redeem his own father's name. His father had only served 1 term as well. John Quincy Adams had a really rough time in the White House, and it was humiliating when he was defeated for re-election. He decided to come back and run for the House, like a much lower position, a House seat, and he won it. And he was never happier because I think he felt liberated. Maybe, who knows, maybe it was less pressure, but he was fervently anti-slavery, and he ended up representing the kidnapped slaves from West Africa who'd been the Mendi people who'd been taken on the slave ship Amistad, which Steven Spielberg made a movie about years ago. And he represented their case in the United States Supreme Court and won, and they won their freedom, and the Mendi people thanked him. But this is a story of a great redemption, of you reach the pinnacle, you think you're president, and then things don't go as planned. But then he redeemed himself and he ended life triumphantly. Conversely, Herbert Hoover is a president who's blamed for the Depression. The stock market crashed 8 months into his time in the White House, and he's remembered as the guy who destroyed the American economy, I would say unfairly. Before that, he was the great humanitarian. He saved millions of Europeans from starving during World War I. He did incredible things as a Secretary of Commerce, but all of that was erased. It's like that was all preseason ball. It didn't count.
There wasn't regular season playoffs.
And for someone like me who likes to be prepared, it hurts to read about someone's life where they did everything they could, they did all the right things, and then it's like, sorry, you're, well, canceled in this case, Herbert Hoover. And so that was a story I thought needed to be told, the pre-presidency of Herbert Hoover and the post-presidency of John Quincy Adams.
I gotcha. So people be reading your book. What are you reading these days? Anything piquing your interest?
I'm reading my friend Peter Sagal's book. He's the host of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. I'm embarrassed that I had not read it until now. I'm going to read my friend Jeannie Gaffigan's book.
About her
cancer,
tumor.
Her tumor. So those are on my list right now.
Gotcha.
I got to get to them, but I'm really excited to read other people's books.
Sure. Yeah. Give me a couple history books that I should be checking out.
Well, one book that I always loved, that I still love, is Teddy Roosevelt is the kind of guy that does more in one page than I'll do in my lifetime. And so once once you surrender to that and stop feeling bad about yourself, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris is a great read. I mean, so that's one that I would say is kind of an extraordinary story. Yeah, and I mean, David McCullough's Truman book is pretty great.
Yeah, he's definitely a good author to check out.
He's great.
Yeah. So when people check out your book, what are some of the big thoughts you want them to have walking away?
I want them, boy, I think I want people to view the past with compassion. I want people to have fun. I like to sort of combine sort of the fun, the rush you get from carbs, sort of the protein.
Yeah.
That kind of
that combination.
With you. That combination. Yeah, I want them to look at figures that they might have written off or think they understand and dig a little deeper. I mean, somebody like, for me, it was my grandmother. For you, it was by your great-grandparents who probably watched a guy named Lawrence Welk, who had the longest-running variety show in history before it was eclipsed by Soul Train. And he was a German immigrant who was an accordionist and had a band and had this incredibly successful TV show that even in its time was seen as really square.
Right.
But he was kind of a badass. He knew his audience, and network executives told him, you need like an edgy comic. You need to have like big guest stars. And he just kept telling them no. They didn't like his accent. He had a strong German accent. He basically, this is my accent. This is the way I talk.
I'm just going to do me, yeah.
And I find that kind of authenticity is something that we all, that I know I'm working towards, of just saying, this is what I do, and I don't care what other people think. In his case, he cared about what he liked doing and what his audience cared about, not what network executives wanted him to do. And he triumphed. And I think he's the farthest thing from a square.
And that was who he was, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what he did.
He played the accordion and he liked polka music, and millions of people loved him for it.
That's amazing. Well, Mo, we love you as well.
Thanks, DJ.
Thanks so much.
Really fun talking to you.
Check out his book, Mobituaries. Check him out at CBS Sunday Morning. For Mo, I'm DJ. See you next time here on Sit Down.